She stood barefoot in the ashes of a massacre, holding a newborn in one arm, a rifle with her father's name in the other, and a U.S. Marshal's badge no one had seen in years. 10 dead men surrounded her. She didn't flinch. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The smoke was thin now, but sharp. It clung to the curls of June Briggs's damp hair and stained the burlap wrapped tight around the child in her arms. Her bare feet were caked in soot and blood, some hers, most not. The 10 bodies sprawled around her were crumpled in unnatural ways, limbs bent like dropped scarecrows, faces frozen in surprise. One had a Marshal star still pinned to his coat. Another had a boot missing and half a jaw. All of them had bullet holes, and none of them were breathing. Sheriff Nathan Carter stepped forward through the scorched dirt, his voice gravel steady, but his hand hovering near his revolver. "You the one did this?" June didn't flinch. "They did it to each other." He studied her. Slender, maybe 5'3", shoulders squared like she'd been holding up something too heavy for too long. Her eyes, gray, rimmed with smoke and something older than fear, rested not on him, but on the rifle across her shoulder, a battered Winchester, its wood scarred with years of use. The initials E.B. had been carved into the stock. One of Carter's deputies, a young buck named Willis, let out a low whistle. "That's Briggs's iron, sure as sunrise. I seen it once, back when he came through on that smuggling case." Carter looked at the badge in June's left hand, tarnished, dented, but real. He stepped closer, slowly, like she was some skittish animal ready to bolt or bite. "Eli Briggs was a good man. Went missing near the Colorado border, never found a trace." "I found him," June said, voice dry as dust. "Found what they left." Her gaze shifted to the baby in her arms. The child was no blood of hers, that much was obvious. Pale, tiny, maybe a week old. Too clean for a girl who hadn't washed. Protected, hidden. "Who's the baby?" Carter asked. June didn't answer right away. The sun was bleeding out behind her, casting long shadows across the corpses. Finally she whispered, "Proof." The word landed heavy. Carter exhaled through his nose, the way men do when they're choosing between order and truth. He looked once more at the rifle, the badge, the girl, the baby, and the bodies. Then he muttered to no one in particular, "Hell of a storm blew through here," and the wind carried the scent of it still. The church house was cold despite the noon sun. Wooden pews, worn thin at the edges, groaned under their own weight. Sheriff Carter stood near the pulpit, arms folded, watching June as she sat on the front bench, a threadbare wool blanket draped around her shoulders. The child, small, impossibly quiet, slept in a crib fashioned from 2 prayer stools lashed together. The doctor had left hours earlier, satisfied the baby would live, but the silence hadn't left with him. Carter hadn't lit the lanterns, let the place stay dim, let the stained glass bleed dull color onto the floor. Truth, he figured, lived better in shadows. June hadn't spoken since dawn. Her chin stayed high, even when her hands trembled. Her hair was still stiff with soot and dried blood. Her dress torn at the collar, her boots unmatched. One leather, one canvas. She looked like she'd crawled out of a grave, but her eyes, those didn't belong to a girl. He finally stepped closer, easing onto the pew opposite her. His voice was even, low. "Town's asking questions." June's reply was barely audible. "Let them." He gave a slow nod. "You ready to talk to me?" She blinked slowly, then reached into the folds of her blanket and pulled something from beneath her waistband. A silver dollar, old and worn, the ridges dulled by time. She rolled it between her fingers. "He left one every time. Under the biscuit tin. Didn't say much else. Just called me June. Never stayed past supper. Carter frowned. Your mother never said who he was? She said he was a man who didn't belong to anyone, but he gave me his name. She looked up then. Briggs. The room seemed to contract. Carter swallowed. You sure? June nodded. Same name I found scratched inside the rifle stock. Same name they said in the tent, before I pulled the trigger. A long breath passed between them. Carter rubbed his jaw. What were they doing out there? She finally turned, eyes sharp. Waiting for a woman. She never came. They took the baby instead. She died fighting them off. He stared at the sleeping child, then back at the girl. You went out there to stop them? I went to finish what he started. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the chapel doors. Inside, neither of them moved. The marshal's office smelled of coal ink and cold metal, and the air outside buzzed with the unfamiliar hum of federal horses and polished boots. By midday, 3 black-coated agents had taken over the sheriff's desk, their words smooth and clinical, their eyes scanning everything but seeing nothing. Sheriff Carter stood by the door, jaw locked, arms crossed. He wasn't a man to rattle easy, but he'd known this wouldn't end in handshakes. Agent Morrell, clean-shaven and sharper than a razored strop, flipped through a leather folio. So you're telling me this girl crossed 2 territories, killed 4 men in federal disguise, and dragged a baby out of a gunfight because of a rumor? She didn't just kill them, Carter said, voice steady. She stopped a massacre no one else cared to see coming. Another agent, Garvey, broader, blunter, snorted. You realize the men she put down were tied to active rail contracts. One of them was the nephew of Senator Randall's campaign treasurer. There's going to be questions, loud ones. And maybe for once, the answers won't come from behind closed doors, Carter said. But it was no use. By sundown, the agents had made it clear. June might be transferred into state custody. Reckless vigilante action, they called it, compromising future investigations. Carter wanted to throw them through his window. Instead, he took a ride. He didn't say where he was going. The old clerk at the Capitol Armory lived in a cabin full of ledgers and rusted bolts. It took one glance at the rifle. This one came through here in 77, serials clean, marked return by widow in 80. The man squinted at Carter. You said Briggs never married? Never even shared a house. Well, the clerk said, tapping the stamped lettering with a grease-blackened finger. Then someone lied on a federal form, which means someone had access to this registry, and something to hide. By the time Carter returned to the church that night, June was sitting alone in a pew, badge balanced on her palm like it might vanish. He sat beside her, told her everything. She didn't cry, didn't flinch. I wasn't supposed to hear it, she said softly. He thought I was asleep when he told Mama. Said if he didn't make it back, she'd know where to start. She closed her hand around the badge. Not a weapon, not a trophy, a vow. The old church was warmer than usual that morning, though the stove hadn't been lit. Maybe it was the crowd, or maybe it was the way everyone leaned forward, silent, expectant, as if the room itself held its breath. No one rang a bell, no one banged a gavel. This wasn't law. This was memory settling its own weight. June Briggs stood in the center, flanked by worn wooden pews and the kind of faces that had once glanced past her mother at the wash basin without ever seeing her. She wore a faded canvas coat too big at the shoulders, sleeves rolled at the cuffs. In her arms, the baby slept, cheeks round and flushed, one tiny fist curled in her collar. Her voice, when she spoke, didn't rise. It didn't have to. My father wasn't a preacher, wasn't a politician. He was a lawman who walked too far down the wrong trail with too few friends at his back. He didn't die in battle. He died buried, by silence, by men too powerful to let his truth breathe. A murmur stirred in the room. Not disagreement, recognition. "I didn't come here for vengeance," she said, glancing down at the infant. "I came to finish what he started, and to keep the next girl from carrying her own badge of grief." Sheriff Carter, hat in hand, stepped forward. The lines in his face were deeper than usual. "And what do you ask?" June's eyes stayed on the child. "A name for him. A home for both of us." There was no vote, no debate. The town gave her both. The marshal's badge, Eli Briggs, was returned to the wall behind Carter's desk, framed in shadow and brass. The rifle, weather-worn and scarred, was melted by the local smith into iron filigree that arched across the orphanage's front gate. No plaque, no inscription, just cold metal that once thundered and now protected. But June stayed. She took over the ledgers, helped run supplies, quieted tears, taught the children how to count by sorting shells and nails, how to listen for danger in the way wind shifted through grass. And sometimes, in the dusk between day and dark, they'd say they saw her. On the orphanage porch, baby, now a boy, curled at her side, a book balanced on her knee, the old rifle leaning within reach. No one asked what she planned next. They didn't need to. Her silence had always said enough.